In an old mansion full of stories and silences, Benjamin, a widower with a kind heart and fragile health, finds in Livia, a dedicated caregiver, a new reason to believe in life. As they try together to fill the void left by time and loss, a shadow from the past threatens the balance they fought to build. Benjamin woke up to the distant sound of church bells. It was a cold, gray morning, and the mansion, normally lit by the soft sun of the early hours, seemed plunged into silent mourning. At 78 years old, Benjamin felt the weight of each of those years in his bones, but it was the absence of Rebecca, his wife of so many years, that really made the days difficult to bear. The vastness of the house, which once brimmed with life, was now an empty echo of the memories of a time that would never return. Every corner of the mansion told a story. The living room, with the old piano that Rebecca played every afternoon, was now dusty, the keys untouched since she was gone. The walls, adorned with photos of the two of them in their happiest moments, seemed to watch him with silent melancholy. He would spend hours in front of these photos, reliving the days that seemed like yesterday, but were increasingly distant. Benjamin's routine was simple and solitary. He would get up, prepare his coffee with shaking hands, and spend the morning reading the newspaper, which he could barely see without the glasses he kept misplacing around the house. Lunch was a bland meal heated in the microwave, and in the afternoon he sat on the porch, watching life go by on the neighborhood's busy street. While the world continued its frantic pace outside, Benjamin lived in a bubble of silence, where time seemed to have stopped. Despite everything, Benjamin refused to leave the mansion. For him, leaving that house would be like abandoning Rebecca a second time. He knew that advancing age made every day a greater challenge, and yet the idea of hiring help was a step he was hesitant to take. It wasn't just pride that held him back, but also the fear of losing the few freedoms he still had left. Nina, his 50-year-old neighbor, was the only person who seemed to realize the depth of Benjamin's loneliness. She visited him almost every day, bringing home-cooked meals and company that, however brief, broke the monotony of Benjamin's days. Nina was a woman with short, gray hair, a warm smile and an attentive gaze that seemed to see beyond the walls and old furniture in the house. She helped him with simple tasks, such as washing clothes or cleaning the rooms that Benjamin no longer had the energy to maintain. But it wasn't just Nina's practical help that made a difference, it was his constant presence and the genuine affection he offered. The trivial conversations they had in the kitchen, while the coffee slowly brewed, were small points of light in Benjamin's dark days. He enjoyed your company, even if he rarely admitted it out loud. Nina's insistence that Benjamin hire a caregiver began after a fall that almost resulted in a serious fracture. The episode occurred on an ordinary morning, while Benjamin was trying to reach something high on the pantry shelf. The cold kitchen floor and the moment of vulnerability were a brutal awakening for Benjamin, who realized that his stubbornness could have serious consequences. "You need help, Benjamin. You can't go on like this," Nina said firmly as she helped him up from the floor. "I care about you." Benjamin's stubbornness eased that day. He spent hours reflecting on Nina's words and how close he had come to disaster. The idea of hiring a caregiver finally stopped being a sign of weakness and started to seem like an inevitable necessity. That's how Benjamin reluctantly agreed to seek professional help. It was a transitional moment in Benjamin's life, marked by the acceptance that he was no longer the independent and strong man he used to be. Taking on a caregiver wasn't just about assistance, it was about allowing someone into his life again, breaking down the barriers he had built after Rebecca's death. With Nina's constant support, Benjamin took the step of contacting a caregiver agency, opening the doors of his home, and his heart, to a new phase he never imagined he would face. The sound of the doorbell echoed throughout the mansion, interrupting the silence that Benjamin had become accustomed to hearing every day. He stood up slowly, feeling the weight of years on his joints, and walked to the door with careful steps. When he opened it, he was met with a young woman who, with a warm smile, seemed to immediately light up the room. "Hello, Mr. Benjamin. I'm Livia, from the caregiver agency," she said, with a soft and welcoming tone of voice. Livia was 25 years old, with a delicate presence and an air of optimism that seemed to contrast with the gloomy atmosphere of the mansion. His black hair cascaded down to his shoulders, and his dark brown eyes conveyed a sincere empathy that, for a moment, made Benjamin feel less alone. "Come in, please," replied Benjamin, with a timid attempt at a smile. He stepped aside, allowing Livia to enter. She walked through the entrance hall with a curious look, observing every detail as if absorbing the story that the walls of the mansion told. The antique piano, the pictures on the walls, and the furniture that looked like it hadn't been moved in decades, everything spoke of the life Benjamin and Rebecca had built together. "This house has a lot of history," commented Livia, breaking the silence as she followed Benjamin on a brief tour of the main rooms. Benjamin nodded, still reluctant to share too much, but feeling a certain calmness in Livia's presence. There was something comforting in the way she looked at him, not with pity, but with a respect he hadn't felt in a long time. While Benjamin showed the kitchen, Livia offered to prepare tea, something simple to warm up the cold morning. They sat at the table, and Benjamin, a little more relaxed, started talking about Rebecca and how they had met in a cafe in the city center, more than 50 years ago. Livia listened attentively, interspersing the conversation with light questions, interested in the stories that seemed so important to Benjamin. As the days went by, Livia began to take her place in Benjamin's routine, helping with the daily tasks that became increasingly difficult for him. She prepared the meals with care, always asking about Benjamin's preferences and even trying to replicate some recipes that Rebecca used to make. She organized the house, bringing a little order to the silent chaos that had arisen after Rebecca's death. Benjamin, initially reticent to accept help, began to appreciate Livia's constant and attentive presence. She not only made their daily tasks easier, but also filled the empty spaces with conversation and light laughter. Little by little, the mansion that seemed to collapse under the weight of memories began to gain new life. However, it wasn't just her work that made Livia stand out to Benjamin. It was the way she genuinely cared about his well-being, how she paid attention to the little things, the tea he preferred, the stories he liked to tell, and even the way he looked out at the garden, a place he loved. He and Rebecca took care of him with so much love. She understood that, for Benjamin, living in that house was not just a matter of convenience, but of keeping the connection with the past alive. One morning, while they were walking through the garden, Benjamin told Livia about the plans he and Rebecca had for that space. "We always dreamed of planting an orchard here," he said, with a sparkle in his eyes that hadn't been seen in a while. "But time passed, and we ended up leaving it for later." Livia, feeling the weight of Benjamin's words, smiled and suggested, "Maybe we can start now, Mr. Benjamin. It's never too late to plant something new." The simplicity of Livia's suggestion touched Benjamin in a way he hadn't expected. For the first time in a long time, he felt a twinge of hope, a desire to move forward and honor the dreams he and Rebecca shared. Livia's presence brought a new rhythm to Benjamin's life. Mornings were no longer marked by absolute silence, but by the smoothness of daily interactions and small gestures that made all the difference. Benjamin began to open up more, not just about the past, but also about his insecurities and fears. Livia listened without judgment, offering support and a friendship that, for Benjamin, became increasingly valuable. And so, day after day, Benjamin discovered that he was not as alone as he imagined. With Livia by his side, the mansion no longer seemed so big, nor the days so long. The house that was once a monument to his loneliness was slowly transforming into a place where the past and present could coexist in harmony. The sound of birds announced the beginning of another day while the timid sun slipped through the clouds, softly illuminating Benjamin's garden. Since Livia's arrival, the elderly man's routine had gained new momentum. The suggestion of planting an orchard, something he and Rebecca had always dreamed of, had ignited a spark of motivation that Benjamin hadn't felt in a long time. That morning would be the first step in transforming that abandoned piece of land into a space full of life and meaning. Livia arrived early, bringing with her lemon and orange tree seedlings and some gardening tools. She carried a lively smile, the kind of enthusiasm that seemed to infect Benjamin every day. They met on the porch, and Benjamin, dressed in an old jacket and a hat he had barely worn since Rebecca left, looked at the seedlings with a mixture of apprehension and hope. "Shall we begin?" Livia asked, with an energy that made it seem like planting the orchard was the most important thing in the world at that moment. Benjamin nodded, feeling the comforting familiarity of the earth beneath his hands as they began to prepare the soil. Each dig was a reminder of the afternoons he and Rebecca spent dreaming about that garden, and Livia's presence at his side seemed to give new meaning to those old dreams. As they worked, Benjamin shared stories about his youth and the challenges of building a business from scratch. Livia listened attentively, asking questions and laughing at Benjamin's jokes. The conversation flowed lightly, and without realizing it, Benjamin was opening up more than he had in years. He talked about the achievements and the losses, and how Rebecca was always by his side, supporting him every step of the way. Livia, in turn, began to share more of her own life. He talked about his difficult childhood, about his brother Julio and the difficulties they faced together. She revealed that the reason for her hard work was to save enough for Julio's surgery, which could allow him to walk again. Livia's stories were full of challenges but also hope, and Benjamin felt a genuine connection with her. She wasn't just a caregiver, she was someone who also knew what it was like to fight for something bigger. Over time, the garden began to take shape. The seedlings planted by Benjamin and Livia now took their place, and the orchard became a symbol of renewal and resilience. Each new leaf that appeared was a reminder that life went on, even after such great losses. Benjamin felt, for the first time in a long time, that he was creating something new, something that could grow and flourish. Little by little, the ties between Benjamin and Livia grew stronger. The trust that developed was built in small gestures, a cup of tea offered in moments of tiredness, the exchange of smiles after a long day of work in the garden, and conversations that filled spaces previously occupied by silence. For Benjamin, those moments meant more than he could express. It was as if, by planting that orchard, he was also planting a new hope in his life. Livia, in turn, found in Benjamin not just a boss, but a friend and a source of wisdom. She appreciated the stories and advice he offered, and felt a genuine responsibility to make sure he was okay. As the days passed, the bond between the two became more and more evident, and the mansion, which had once seemed so desolate, now vibrated with the energy of a blossoming friendship. When the day in the garden came to an end, Benjamin and Livia sat on the porch, admiring the work they had done. The sun was already setting, dyeing the sky in orange and pink tones. Benjamin looked at Livia, feeling gratitude that went beyond words. "Thank you, Livia," he said, with a smile that reflected both exhaustion and satisfaction. "For helping me do this. Rebecca would have loved it." Livia returned the smile, feeling part of something bigger. "It was a pleasure, Mr. Benjamin. I think we're just getting started." That afternoon ended with a comfortable silence between the two, marked only by the soft rustle of leaves in the new orchard. Benjamin knew that this garden would be a legacy, proof that, even in the most difficult times, there would always be something worth fighting for. And, alongside Livia, he felt that there was still a lot to live and share. The days at Benjamin's mansion followed a new rhythm, filled with the enthusiasm of the mornings in the garden and the conversations that warmed up the afternoons. Livia's presence became increasingly indispensable, and Benjamin could no longer imagine his days without the sparkle that she brought to his routine. However, life had a way of testing even the strongest of bonds, and Benjamin would soon find himself faced with a reality that would test his newfound confidence. One cloudy morning, Benjamin woke up feeling unusually uncomfortable. His vision was blurred, and he felt weak, as if an invisible weight was pressing him against the bed. When Livia arrived, she found him trying to get up with difficulty, leaning on the furniture as if they were his only support. Worried, she ran to him, helping him sit down carefully on the armchair in the living room. "Mr. Benjamin, are you okay?" Livia asked, her voice filled with genuine concern. Benjamin tried to smile, but the gesture came out more like a grimace. "Just a little dizzy," he replied, downplaying what was clearly significant discomfort. But Livia wasn't fooled. She insisted that Benjamin see a doctor, arguing that his health should not be neglected, especially considering his advanced age and recent episodes of weakness. Although reluctant, Benjamin ended up giving in to Livia's insistence. At the doctor's office, the situation turned out to be more serious than both expected. After some tests, the doctor informed that Benjamin was suffering from high blood pressure and needed more rigorous care. The diagnosis shook Benjamin, who until then had been proud of his independence, despite the limitations of his age. Back at the mansion, Benjamin was thoughtful. He knew he needed to make changes to his routine, but the weight of the news made him feel even more vulnerable. Livia, however, was determined to help him face that challenge. She rearranged meal times, adapted menus, and ensured that Benjamin took his medication at the right time. Furthermore, she began to accompany him on light walks around the garden, encouraging him to move, even if it was just a little at a time. Despite Livia's constant support, Benjamin could not avoid the feeling of impotence that invaded him. He found himself, once again, confronted with the inevitability of time and the fragility that came with it. However, Livia was by his side, reminding him that he didn't need to face this alone. The relationship between the two grew even closer, and Benjamin began to realize that trusting someone was not a sign of weakness, but of courage. One day, while Benjamin was resting on the balcony, watching the seedlings grow in the garden, Livia sat next to him and shared some news she had received that morning. "Julio, my brother, got an appointment with a specialist," she said, with a hopeful smile. "It's the first step toward surgery." Benjamin was happy for Livia, feeling that her achievements were, in a way, also his. He knew how much Livia had sacrificed to get to this point, and seeing her determination inspired Benjamin to continue fighting for his own health. The orchard they planted together was a reflection of that, a reminder that despite the odds, there was always something worth pushing forward for. However, Benjamin's difficulties were not just limited to physical health. On a rainy afternoon, while Livia was in the kitchen preparing dinner, Benjamin felt a sharp pain in his chest that made him lose his breath. He tried to call for Livia, but his voice wouldn't come out, and in a few seconds, everything around him went dark. Livia found Benjamin lying next to the armchair, unconscious. Panic took over her, but she quickly picked up the phone and called an ambulance, staying by Benjamin's side and holding his hand until help arrived. Those minutes seemed like hours, and Livia's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, fearing the worst, but refusing to let Benjamin face it alone. At the hospital, Benjamin was stabilized, but the incident served as a wake-up call for both of them. When Benjamin finally regained consciousness, he found Livia sitting next to him, her eyes red with worry. I thought I was going to lose you," she said, holding Benjamin's hand tightly. Benjamin looked at her, his eyes tired but full of gratitude. "You won't get rid of me that easily," he replied, with a weak but genuine smile. That moment consolidated the certainty that Livia was more than just a caregiver, she was a true friend, someone willing to face challenges by her side. From that day on, Benjamin understood that the trust he placed in Livia was not just a choice, but a necessity. He knew that with her by his side, he could face anything, and that together they could continue to plant new seeds of hope, even in the most difficult terrain. The weeks following Benjamin's hospital incident were marked by a new dynamic in the mansion. Livia dedicated herself even more to caring for the elderly, while Benjamin, now more aware of the limitations imposed by age, tried to accept the changes necessary for his health. The routine was adjusted, but something subtle hovered in the air, a mix of gratitude and a growing curiosity on Benjamin's part about Livia's life beyond the walls of the mansion. One day, while they were drinking tea on the balcony, Benjamin observed Livia with an attentive look. She seemed distant, thoughtful, as if she carried an invisible weight. He noticed that, despite her constant dedication, Livia rarely spoke about herself, except for brief mentions about her brother Julio and her desire to provide a better life for him. Benjamin felt that there was something more, something that Livia wasn't saying. "Livia, do you mind telling me more about yourself? I don't mean to be nosy, but I feel like there's a lot you keep to yourself," Benjamin said, trying to break down the barrier he felt between them. Livia hesitated, her usual smile disappearing for a moment. She looked at the garden, as if searching for answers among the trees and flowers they had planted together. "It's not easy to talk about this," Livia began, her voice low and controlled. "But I think you deserve to know." She paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "My past is not something I'm proud of. I made the wrong choices, I got involved with the wrong people, and it almost cost me everything I had. That's why I decided to change my life and start over, working as a caregiver. It's a way to redeem myself, to find a purpose." Benjamin listened in silence, noticing Livia's vulnerability. He could see that the words came from a deep place, where hurt and regret were still present. "We all have our mistakes," he said, with an understanding tone. "The important thing is what we do after them. And from what I see, you're trying to do your best." Livia smiled slightly, but her eyes remained heavy. "I really care about you, Mr. Benjamin. And with Julio. I want to believe that there is still time to do the right things." There was a fervor in her words, a hope that, even with her difficult past, Livia didn't want to let go. However, Benjamin didn't know how much of Livia's past was about to resurface and how this would impact the relationship they built. The day seemed peaceful, but the serenity was broken by an unexpected visitor. While Livia was in the kitchen, the doorbell rang, and Benjamin, still a little weak, walked to the door. When he opened it, he found a tall man, with a robust appearance and a familiar face to Livia. The discomfort was evident. "Is Livia there?" asked the man with an authoritative tone, without even introducing himself. Benjamin hesitated for a moment, but before he could respond, Livia appeared in the corridor, paralyzed at the sight of the visitor. "Matthew," Livia murmured, her voice full of surprise and concern. The tension between them was palpable, and Benjamin, sensing something wasn't right, took a step back, observing the interaction. Matthias seemed to know Livia well, but not in a friendly way. His look was demanding, as if something pending still needed to be resolved. Livia closed the door behind her, leaving Benjamin inside. He could hear fragments of the conversation through the wood, but the words he caught were enough to understand that Matthias was part of the complicated past that Livia had mentioned. Matthias' tone was insistent, and Livia seemed to be defensive, as if she were trying to protect something, or someone. When Livia went back inside, her face was pale and her hands were shaking. Benjamin looked at her, waiting for her to explain, but Livia just shook her head. "I'm sorry, Mr. Benjamin. I need to sort out some things." Without waiting for a response, she grabbed her things and hurriedly left, leaving Benjamin with more questions than answers. Benjamin spent the rest of the day lost in thought. He trusted Livia, but Matthias's visit had planted a seed of uncertainty. Who was he really, and why did he seem to have so much control over Livia? Benjamin worried, not only about Livia's well-being, but also about the impact that her past could have on everything they were building together. That night, Benjamin felt loneliness once again. The mansion, which had begun to fill with life and joy, seemed to be plunged into a heavy silence. He sat in the armchair and looked at the garden through the window, thinking about how things had changed since Livia came into his life. He didn't know what the future held, but he was sure of one thing: Livia had become an essential part of his routine, and he was willing to weather any storm that came with it. As the shadows of night lengthened, Benjamin made a silent vow not to abandon Livia, no matter what her past brought to light. After all, he also knew what it was like to live with regrets and secrets. And in a way, he felt like they were both planting something new, not just in the garden, but in their own lives. The days after Matthias' visit were marked by invisible tension in the mansion. Livia continued to carry out her tasks with the same dedication, but Benjamin could see that something had changed. She was more distant, often lost in thought, and the smile that was once constant now appeared less frequently. Benjamin respected Livia's space, but his concern grew every day. He felt like he was losing the person who had brought new life to his routine, and the silence between them, which had once been comfortable, now felt like an abyss. One rainy morning, while preparing breakfast together, Benjamin finally decided to break the ice. "Livia, you know you can count on me, don't you?" he said, trying to catch Livia's gaze, who was fixed on the cup of tea she was holding. "If you need help with anything, I'm here." Livia sighed, leaving the cup on the table and finally meeting Benjamin's eyes. "I know, Mr. Benjamin. And I am very grateful for that. But there are things from my past that I need to resolve on my own." Her voice was firm, but Benjamin could see the internal struggle that Livia was having. He wanted to help her, but he also knew that some battles needed to be faced individually. That afternoon, while Benjamin was resting in the living room armchair, the doorbell rang again. His heart raced at the memory of his last visit, but he got up and went to the door. This time, it was Julio, Livia's brother, in his wheelchair, with a shy smile on his face. Benjamin greeted him warmly and invited him in. They sat in the living room, and Benjamin took the opportunity to get to know better the young man that Livia mentioned so much. Julio was a soft-spoken young man, with an intelligence that shined through his words. He spoke about his dreams, about the studies he was doing and his desire to be able to walk one day. Benjamin felt an immediate affection for Julio, noticing in him the same determination he saw in Livia. However, during the conversation, Julio mentioned Mateus, without knowing how much his name was already a weight on Benjamin's mind. "Matthew has always had a bad influence on my sister," said Julius, with a sigh. "They had a complicated history, and even after everything, he still shows up every now and then, bringing trouble." Benjamin listened carefully, connecting the pieces of the puzzle. It was clear that Mateus represented a danger to Livia, and perhaps he was the reason why she was so restless. Benjamin, feeling a responsibility to protect Livia, began thinking of ways to help, even if she hadn't asked. At the end of the afternoon, Livia returned and found Benjamin and Julio laughing in the living room, sharing childhood stories and happy moments. Seeing her brother getting along so well with Benjamin, Livia felt temporary relief, as if, for a moment, the external complications had no place there. But she knew she needed to face Matthew and close the chapter he represented in her life. After saying goodbye to Julio, Livia sat next to Benjamin. "Thank you for welcoming Julio. He really enjoyed spending time with you," she said with a genuine smile, the first Benjamin had seen in days. He reciprocated, but couldn't help but bring up the topic that was on his mind. "Livia, who is Mateus to you?" he asked, careful not to sound invasive, but determined to understand more. Livia was silent for a moment, as if pondering whether or not she should share more. Finally, she relented, feeling that Benjamin deserved to know the truth. "Matthew was someone important to me in the past. We were very young and we made a lot of bad choices together," Livia began, her voice full of restrained emotion. "He got involved with dangerous things, and I was dragged along. By the time I realized what I was getting myself into, it was too late. It took me years to get out of that life, to get away from him. But Mateus never accepted my decision to leave." Benjamin listened carefully, feeling the pain in Livia's words. He understood the weight of the past, of choices that left deep marks. "And now he wants something from you?" Benjamin asked, trying to connect the pieces. Livia nodded, looking at her hands. "He wants money, something I can't, and won't, give him. I've worked so hard to build a new life, to help Julio, and I'm not going to let Mateus ruin that." There was a firmness in Livia's words, a decision not to allow the past to dictate her future. Benjamin felt a mixture of admiration and concern. He knew that Livia was strong, but he also knew that the weight of facing Mateus alone was too great. You don't have to do this alone, Livia. There is always a way out, Benjamin said, trying to offer support without being intrusive. Livia smiled slightly, a sad but grateful smile. Thank you, Mr. Benjamin. I know you care, and that means a lot to me. I just need time to work this out my way. She stood up, giving Benjamin a gentle pat on the shoulder before retreating to the garden. Benjamin was left alone in the room, reflecting on everything he had learned about Livia that day. He knew he couldn't force her to accept his help, but he was determined to be there for her no matter what. The trust they built wasn't just a one-way street. He also felt he had a responsibility to Livia, not just as a caregiver, but as a friend. As the sun set, Benjamin looked at the orchard they had planted together. The young trees swayed lightly in the wind, a symbol of what was yet to come. And, at that moment, he made a silent promise to continue by Livia's side, helping her face whatever the past brought back. The days at Benjamin's mansion became increasingly tense with the constant presence of Livia's worries. She continued to carry out her responsibilities, but Benjamin could see the shadow of restlessness hanging over her. The past she was trying to leave behind seemed more present than ever, especially after Matthew's visit. Benjamin, determined to help in some way, decided to act, even though he knew that Livia would not like to be confronted. One morning, while Livia was busy in the kitchen, Benjamin picked up the phone and called Nina, his neighbor and longtime friend. He knew that Nina had an extensive network of contacts, which could be useful in finding out more about Matthias and his intentions. "Nina, I need a favor," Benjamin said, with a serious tone he hadn't used in a long time. He explained the situation, detailing Matthias's visit and the impact it was having on Livia. Nina, always ready to help, promised to do her best to find out what she could about Matthias. "Leave it to me, Benjamin. We'll figure it out," she replied, with her usual confidence. Although Benjamin felt relieved that he was taking some action, he knew that he needed to keep everything secret until he had something concrete. He didn't want to worry Livia even more, especially without knowing what was really going on. While Nina investigated, Benjamin and Livia tried to keep their routine as normal as possible. The orchard continued to grow, and days spent working in the garden offered a temporary escape from the problems they both faced. However, Benjamin couldn't ignore the tiredness he saw in Livia's eyes, nor the fear she tried to hide behind forced smiles. He knew that, soon, something would have to change. On a particularly cold afternoon, Livia received a call that made her face turn pale. Benjamin, who was in the room, noticed the immediate change in her expression and approached her, worried. "Livia, is everything okay?" he asked, watching her hang up the phone with shaking hands. Livia looked at Benjamin, her eyes filled with a fear that she could no longer hide. "It's Matthias," she said, almost in a whisper. "He wants me to meet him tonight. He said he has something important to resolve." There was a mixture of anger and resignation in Livia's voice, as if she knew there was no way to escape that encounter. Benjamin felt the immediate impulse to stop Livia from going, but he knew it would be no use. He also understood that Livia was at a crossroads, facing not only the ghosts of her past, but also the choices that would define her future. "If you're going, don't go alone," Benjamin suggested, trying to find a middle ground. "Take someone with you, please. Or let me go." Livia shook her head. "I need to do this alone, Mr. Benjamin. But thank you for worrying." There was a firmness to Livia's decision, and Benjamin knew he couldn't change her mind. He just nodded, respecting her decision but feeling helpless. At the end of the afternoon, as Livia prepared to leave, Benjamin watched her in silence. She was dressed simply, but her expression was that of someone preparing for battle. Benjamin walked over, holding her hands for a brief moment. "If you need anything, you know where to find me," he said, with a look of sincere concern. Livia smiled, a small but genuine smile. "Thank you, Mr. Benjamin. I promise I will be careful." With that, she said goodbye and walked out the front door, leaving Benjamin with a heavy heart and a silent prayer that everything would work out. Night fell over the mansion, bringing with it a storm that seemed to reflect Benjamin's inner turmoil. He paced back and forth across the room, unable to relax. The rain pounded against the windows, and thunder echoed through the house, amplifying the feeling of unrest. Every sound seemed like an omen, and Benjamin couldn't shake the feeling that something bad was about to happen. Hours passed, and there was no sign of Livia. Benjamin tried reading, listening to music, doing anything to distract his mind, but nothing seemed to work. Finally, around midnight, he heard the front door open. Livia entered, soaked from the rain, with her eyes red and her face marked by worry. "Livia, what happened?" Benjamin asked, rushing to help her take off her wet coat. Livia didn't respond immediately. She sat on the couch, shivering from both the cold and nervousness. After a few seconds of silence, she began to speak, her voice low and hesitant. "Matthew wants money, more than I have or will ever have," she said, with a heavy sigh. "He is desperate, he got involved with dangerous people, and he thinks I can help him get out of this. I said I can't, but he won't take no for an answer." Benjamin felt anger rising within him. He didn't understand how someone could put so much pressure on Livia, especially knowing her circumstances. "And what are you going to do?" he asked, although he feared the answer. Livia shook her head, looking at Benjamin with eyes full of sadness. "I don't know. I just know that I won't let him ruin everything I worked for. But I need to think, I need to find a way out." She got up, and Benjamin accompanied her to the bedroom, where she retired in silence, clearly exhausted. That night, Benjamin stayed up late, thinking about how he could help Livia. He knew his options were limited, but he also knew he couldn't sit idly by while she faced such a huge storm alone. He decided that, the next day, he would talk to Nina about what he had discovered, and together, they would try to find a way to protect Livia from Matthias and the past that insisted on persecuting her. The next morning, Benjamin woke up early, still weighed down by the previous night's worries. The sky remained cloudy, reflecting the tense atmosphere inside the mansion. He made his breakfast slowly, waiting for Livia to come down to join him, but she remained in her room, probably trying to recover from the pressures she faced the night before. Determining that he needed to act, Benjamin called Nina once again, eager for any news that could help Livia. Nina had spent the night making calls and researching Matthias, and when she answered the phone, her voice showed an unusual seriousness. "Benjamin, I discovered some things about Matthew. And it's not good news," Nina said bluntly. Benjamin listened as Nina explained that Matthias was involved with a criminal group that operated in the region. Gambling debts and dubious business dealings had led Matthias into a desperate situation, and he was willing to use any means to get out of the hole he found himself in. Benjamin felt a chill when he thought about the extent of Matthias' problems and how this put Livia at risk. "Nina, we need to protect Livia," Benjamin said firmly. "She can't deal with this alone. We have to find a way to get Matthew away from her." Nina agreed, suggesting that they seek out a lawyer or even the police to understand the best legal options. Benjamin, although worried about Livia's reaction, knew that this was a necessary action. While Benjamin was planning his next steps, Livia finally went down to the kitchen. She looked tired, but grateful for Benjamin's silent support. "Mr. Benjamin, I'm sorry about yesterday," she began, sitting down at the table. "I didn't want to worry you, but I don't know what else to do." Benjamin looked at Livia, determined not to hide what he had discovered. "Livia, I talked to Nina. She helped me better understand the situation with Matthias. He's in serious trouble, but you shouldn't feel obligated to fix his mistakes. You deserve peace, and we will find a way to ensure that." Livia was silent for a moment, absorbing Benjamin's words. It was as if a huge weight was being shared, and she felt a mixture of relief and fear. "I know he's in trouble," she admitted, her voice shaking. "But he's a part of my past that I can't just ignore, even though everything inside me wants to leave it behind." Benjamin approached, holding Livia's hands firmly. You are not alone, Livia. And you don't have to carry the weight of Matthew's past. We will get through this together, and no matter what happens, you have my support. There was a deep sincerity in Benjamin's voice, something that touched Livia more than any comforting word she had ever received. Livia smiled, a small but genuine smile. Thank you, Mr. Benjamin. This means more than you can imagine. For the first time in days, Livia felt that there was a light at the end of the tunnel, a hope that she could find a way out without compromising everything she had built. However, the tranquility was short-lived. At the end of the afternoon, while Benjamin and Livia were in the garden, the doorbell rang once again. Benjamin felt his heart race when he heard the sound, immediately remembering Matthew's last visit. When he opened the door, he found an official-looking man, dressed in a dark suit, with a serious expression on his face. Good afternoon, I'm Matthias' lawyer, said the man, handing Benjamin an envelope. My client is willing to resolve the situation with Ms. Livia amicably, but needs her to meet with him to discuss terms. Benjamin took the envelope, trying to remain calm as the lawyer left without saying anything else. Upon opening the envelope, Benjamin found a handwritten letter from Matthias, full of demands and empty promises. Matthias offered a quick and convenient solution to their problems, as long as Livia gave him a considerable amount of money. It was an obvious trap, a last desperate effort to manipulate Livia and take advantage of her compassion. Benjamin took the letter to Livia, who read it in silence, her face closing as she absorbed each word. He's not going to stop, is he? She said, with a bitterness Benjamin had not seen before. No matter how hard I try, he will always want more. Benjamin nodded, understanding Livia's frustration. Livia, we need to involve the police. Matthias can't keep threatening you like that. He has crossed all limits, and it is time for us to put an end to it. Livia hesitated, knowing that the exposure could bring more complications, but when she looked at Benjamin, she saw not just a friend, but an ally willing to fight at her side. Okay, she said finally. Let's do this. But I promise myself that after this, I won't look back. There was a new resolve in Livia's voice, a determination to protect not only herself, but also Benjamin and Julio, who depended on her strength. That night, Benjamin and Livia sat on the porch, watching the dark sky begin to open up to the stars. The storm that had gathered over their heads had not yet completely dissipated, but there was a renewed sense of calm. They knew that the battles they faced were not easy, but together, they believed they could overcome any obstacle. Benjamin looked at Livia, feeling deep admiration for her courage. You are stronger than you know, Livia. And I am sure that no matter what happens, you will find a path to the peace you deserve. Livia smiled, holding Benjamin's hand. With you by my side, Mr. Benjamin, I know I can face anything. And so, as the stars shone above them, the two made a silent promise to protect each other, making it clear that although life storms were inevitable, there was always a new dawn waiting to light the way. The sun had barely risen above the horizon when Benjamin and Livia met in the kitchen, both with serious expressions and determined to move forward with the plan they had drawn up the night before. The decision to involve the police was not easy, but it was the only way to deal with Matthias' threats definitively. Livia, still apprehensive, knew that the step they were about to take would change her life in ways she could not predict. Are you ready for this? Benjamin asked, as he placed the coffee cups on the table. He could see the tension in Livia's shoulders, but also a firm resolve in her eyes. Ready or not, I have no choice, replied Livia, trying to keep her voice steady. Matthew has controlled my life for too long. It's time to put an end to this. There was a mix of fear and relief in his words, as if he had finally found the courage to face what he had avoided for so long. Nina arrived shortly after, accompanied by a police officer who she had contacted to advise them on the best path forward. The officer, a middle-aged man with a serious air, explained the situation in simple terms, Matthias was involved in criminal activities, and the demands made on Livia were clearly extortion. He suggested that Livia could press charges and request a restraining order, which would begin an official investigation. Livia listened attentively, absorbing every detail as the police officer spoke. Benjamin was at her side, offering the silent support that had become so valuable. When the officer finished, Livia took a deep breath and nodded. "Let's do this," she said, with renewed conviction. "I will not let Matthew control my future." The morning was filled with bureaucracy and the process of formalizing the complaint. Livia spent hours at the police station, retelling the story of her relationship with Matthias, from their first meetings to their darkest moments. It was a painful process, reliving every detail, but she knew it was necessary. Benjamin remained by her side the entire time, holding her hand and reminding her that she was not alone. When they finally returned to the mansion, Livia was visibly exhausted. Benjamin prepared a simple meal, and they sat on the porch, enjoying the afternoon silence as a balm for their frayed nerves. Nina, who had stayed at the mansion to organize some things while they were away, joined them with a reassuring smile. "You were brave today," said Nina, placing a tray of tea on the table. "It's not easy to face the past, but you're doing the right thing." Livia smiled slightly, still processing the day's events. "Thank you, Nina. I know this is all complicated, but I'm determined to move forward." Benjamin nodded, proud of the strength that Livia demonstrated. He knew the path ahead was still uncertain, but he felt that together they could overcome anything. However, as they tried to find a moment of peace, a feeling of unrest persisted. Matthias was not the type to give up easily, and the possibility of retaliation hung like a dark cloud over their heads. Livia knew that, although they had taken an important step, they still needed to be prepared for what came next. That night, while Benjamin was reviewing some papers in the living room, Livia retired to her bedroom, feeling tiredness finally weighing her down. Closing her eyes, she tried to find solace in the idea that she had made the right choice, even though the future still seemed uncertain. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to dream of a tomorrow without fear, a tomorrow where she could walk freely without the shadows of the past. Benjamin, on the other hand, couldn't sleep. He knew that Matthias still posed a threat and that they would need to be cautious in the coming days. Sitting in his favorite armchair, he looked at the old photographs of Rebecca on the wall, seeking some silent guidance from the woman who had always known how to handle difficult situations. As he contemplated the past, an idea began to take shape in Benjamin's mind. He knew they needed something more than just a restraining order to protect Livia. They needed a plan to ensure Matthew could no longer interfere in their lives. And to do so, Benjamin was willing to go the extra mile, even if it meant facing risks he never imagined he would have to consider. The next morning, Benjamin called an old contact from his days in business, someone who could help tighten security around the mansion and offer advice on how to handle sensitive situations like Matthew's. He knew that Livia might not agree with his approach, but he also knew that he needed to do everything in his power to protect her. When Livia came down for breakfast, Benjamin explained his plan carefully, emphasizing the need to prepare for any eventuality. "I don't want you to feel watched or trapped, Livia," he said, trying to ease her worries. "But I need to make sure you're safe." Livia listened, initially hesitant, but gradually recognizing the wisdom in Benjamin's approach. "Okay," she agreed, with a sigh. "Let's do this your way. I don't want to live in fear, and I trust you, Mr. Benjamin." With Livia's support, Benjamin put his plan into action. They beefed up the mansion's security, adjusted their routines to avoid predictable patterns, and maintained a direct line to authorities, ready for any new move by Matthias. It was a game of patience and vigilance, but together, they were determined to win. In the days that followed, Benjamin and Livia continued their lives as best they could. The orchard, now flourishing with the trees they had planted together, became a symbol of hope and perseverance. Each new sprout was a reminder that even in the most difficult circumstances, there was always the possibility for renewal and growth. And so, as the sun set over the mansion, casting a golden glow over the garden, Benjamin and Livia sat side by side, contemplating the future with a new perspective. They knew the road ahead was still full of challenges, but they were ready to face them, confident that together they could weather any storm. In the days that followed, Benjamin's mansion became a true center of operations. Benjamin's contact, a former business colleague named Arthur, arrived at the house bringing with him a cold, practical approach to Livia's situation. Arthur, a middle-aged man with a confident air and an intimidating presence, quickly assessed the situation and began implementing measures to ensure everyone's safety. "We will reinforce security at all entry and exit points," Arthur said, clipboard in hand as he surveyed the mansion's perimeter. "And I want everyone to keep their phone nearby. If there is any sign of trouble, call immediately." Benjamin watched the planning with a mix of relief and concern. He knew these measures were necessary, but he also felt the weight of the situation on his shoulders. He didn't want his house to turn into a fortress, but protecting Livia was his priority. His heart sank at how his peaceful life had been so abruptly interrupted by issues that seemed so far from his reality. Livia, on the other hand, was torn between gratitude and the feeling of being suffocated by constant surveillance. She appreciated Benjamin and Arthur's efforts to keep her safe, but she couldn't help the discomfort of feeling that Matthew still had some control over her life, even from a distance. Still, she tried to adapt, knowing this was her best chance to finally free herself from the past. One afternoon, while Arthur guided the installation of cameras around the garden, Livia and Benjamin sat on the balcony, watching the movement with silent glances. Benjamin broke the silence first, noticing Livia's uneasiness. "I know this all seems like an exaggeration," he said softly. "But I'd rather err on the side of excess than risk your safety." Livia nodded, still looking at the men installing the equipment. "I understand, Mr. Benjamin. And I appreciate everything you're doing. I just don't want this to become a burden for you." There was a sincerity in her voice, an acknowledgement of how far Benjamin was willing to go to protect her. Benjamin smiled, trying to convey the calm he himself was looking for. "You're part of my life now, Livia. It's not a burden, it's a choice. And no matter what happens, we'll get through this together." Benjamin's words offered comfort that Livia didn't know she needed. She realized that, for the first time in a long time, she wasn't fighting alone. This was a shared battle, and with Benjamin by her side, she felt like she could face whatever came. Arthur approached, bringing new updates on the house's security. "We're almost done here," he said, with a serious look. "But we need to discuss a long-term strategy. It's not enough to just react, we need to anticipate Matthew's movements." Benjamin and Livia listened attentively as Arthur outlined a more comprehensive plan, which included monitoring Matthias' activities and seeking legal measures to strengthen Livia's protection. It was a meticulous approach, and although tiring, it seemed to be the only way to ensure that Matthias would not find any more loopholes to exploit. During the discussions, Livia found herself reflecting on how she got to that point. There was something almost surreal about having to plan your life in terms of security and defense strategies. She remembered when she started working as a caregiver, just looking for a new beginning for herself and Julio. "I could never have imagined that I would end up involving other people in my problems." As Arthur spoke, Benjamin looked at Livia, noticing the distant expression on her face. He interrupted Arthur for a moment and turned to Livia, lightly touching her arm. "Livia, I know this is all a lot, but remember that you deserve a future free from these fears. We are here to help you achieve that." Livia took a deep breath and nodded, trying to absorb Benjamin's positivity. "I know. And I'm so grateful. I just want this to be over with." Benjamin and Arthur exchanged a look of understanding. They knew the path would not be easy, but they were determined to move forward. In the following days, the mansion entered a new rhythm. Security measures were in full operation, and Benjamin, Livia and Arthur maintained constant surveillance. Everything seemed under control until one afternoon when one of the motion alarms sounded outside the house. Benjamin rushed to check the monitor, while Arthur prepared to act. The camera showed a shadowy figure moving near the gate, but before they could identify it, the figure disappeared. It was a reminder that Matthias was still around, trying to find a way to infiltrate Livia's life again. Benjamin felt a surge of frustration, but also a renewed sense of urgency. "We won't let him in," said Arthur, with unwavering determination. "But we need to be careful." Livia, seeing the images, felt a shiver run down her spine. Matthew's face was unclear, but his presence was unmistakable. She knew this was just the beginning and that they would need all their strength and resilience to overcome the challenge ahead. That night, as Benjamin and Livia talked on the balcony, the tension seemed less intense than on previous nights. They knew the journey was still long, but there was a feeling of unity that strengthened them. Livia, looking at the starry sky, felt a new determination grow within her. No matter how many times Matthew tried, she was determined not to let him control her destiny. Benjamin, next to her, shared the same feeling. He knew that protecting Livia meant more than just keeping Matthias away, it was about helping her regain control of her own life. And with each new day, they were one step closer to achieving that freedom.